Throughout its history, Vietnam was usually under Chinese rule. But in the 19th century, the French took over this piece of land and claimed ownership on Vietnam. The French don't leave Vietnam until the year 1940, when Nazi Germany takes over France, and Japan sees an opportunity and takes over. Around the same time, a gentleman by the name of Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist, started fighting with the Japanese. When Japan is defeated and the war is over, Ho Chi Minh claims ownership of the entire place and starts a new communist country, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. From 1945 to 1950, communism grows all over the world, and the Americans are of course very against this idea. At this time, China is a communist country, the USSR was a communist nation, and when they see a country that wants to go the socialist route, they will support it. Ho Chi Minh loses control from the entire country, and that's because the French come back to the southern part of Vietnam. After this, the Westerners control South Vietnam, and the Communists control Northern Vietnam. To be specific, China and the USSR. The Westerners choose a person by the name of Bao Dai to be in charge of South Vietnam. From 1953, you could say the French are fighting with the North Vietnamese, but it's not serious yet. And it's the same era where Eisenhower, the President of the United States, is debating whether he should go to the war or not, because he's worried that the French will lose South Vietnam to the Communists. This debate went on for years, but Eisenhower never decided to go in. In 1954, everybody recognizes that Vietnam is in two pieces, and just like North and South Korea, you have two different Vietnams. The Westerners choose a person by the name of Ngo Diem to be the Prime Minister of South Vietnam, but communism has already begun in Northern Vietnam. All the lands are being taken, the riches are being eliminated and their lands are being taken, and all the money is controlled by the government. The Westerners completely cut off South Vietnam and named it Republic of Vietnam, and there was also a city at the bottom of Vietnam called Saigon, and they made it the capital city. When North Vietnam realized that they chose the name of a country and chose a capital city, they got very upset, and it was because of this that the war started between North and South Vietnam and paralyzed the entire region. The Americans didn't want communism to spread around this area, and that is why any communism propaganda in South Vietnam would lead a person to the death penalty. That's how seriously they took it. When we're in 1955, the war between South and North Vietnam is getting very serious, but it's not as big as it once is. 5 years after this is taking place, the North Vietnamese start a new strategy, and they start taking weapons to South Vietnam through Cambodia and Laos. And their idea was to give these weapons to communist people in South Vietnam so they can fight for them. The people that did this were called the Viet Cong. But what does Viet Cong mean anyways? Anti-communist Vietnamese would call Northern Vietnamese communists Viet Cong, and it basically means a communist traitor to Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh could send weapons with the help of the Viet Cong to South Vietnam, and it was specially gone through Laos and Cambodia. The Viet Congs would usually pinpoint themselves to poor areas, especially farmers, the ones that would accept communism harder than anyone else. And that is the exact reason why the Viet Cong could easily grow an army by just talking to these farmers. When we get to 1963, the war is continuing on and it doesn't seem like it wants to stop. But John F. Kennedy is watching this war from afar and he's thinking on what to do. It was recently that John F. Kennedy lost Cuba to communism, and he doesn't want it to happen again to Vietnam. He first starts sending money and supplies for the South Vietnamese. At this time, most of the Vietnamese population are Buddhists, but the government that was put in place by the French in South Vietnam was Christian. And that is why the Christian government is always making trouble with the Buddhist population and telling them to change their religion, to change this, to change that. And that is why the Buddhist people are extremely against this government by now. After this, a lot of the people in South Vietnam were against the South Vietnam government. And while all this is going on, the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, is assassinated, and Lyndon B. Johnson is now the new president. Immediately, Johnson tells a few CIA agents to go to South Vietnam and train the soldiers there to fight better. Next to Vietnam, there is a gulf called the Gulf of Tonkin, and there was a US destroyer around there just hanging out. And then 4 Vietnamese boats surround the destroyer and start shooting at the boat. And that is why the commander says to shoot at all the boats, and they're all killed immediately. All 4 boats are hit and all the Vietnamese died. And it basically gave the US government, aka Lyndon B. Johnson, an excuse to declare war on North Vietnam. And 2 days later, the bombing began. Not just any bomber, B-52 bombers that rained hell. In the year 1965, since the Americans declare war on Vietnam, they're forced to draft young men to go fight for them. The war began, but it quickly turned into a stalemate. The Viet Congs would strategically fight by a little bit and then retreat, and the Americans continuously drop bombs on North Vietnam. And unfortunately, mostly civilians are being killed by these. One of the types of bombs that the Americans would drop in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia was napalm. Since the Vietnamese were mostly in jungles and they had tunnels, these hellish bombs would catch everything on fire and cook whatever is inside these jungles. More than 200,000 American soldiers are sent to Vietnam to fight this pointless war. Because of the geographic location and the Viet Cong, it didn't allow the Americans to move a foot. Even though they had the most advanced military with the most advanced weapons, they couldn't do anything about it. Just like we said, the Vietnamese would not fight head on. They would surprise attack and retreat. Not only would they hide between the trees, but they also had tunnel systems everywhere, and they could surround a group of soldiers like it's nothing. And most importantly, they knew the entire place, while the American soldiers didn't even know what part of the world they're in. And that's why the Viet Congs could not be defeated. So the war is not going good for anybody. The Americans have technology, the Viet Congs know the place better, and the people are taking side with the communist government. And that is why nobody is winning in this situation. In 1968, just like old school war, North Vietnamese carry 68,000 people over the border, and just like back in the day, surprise attack the South. Since it was a surprise attack, they very quickly reached the city of Hoi An, but over there it was a stalemate once again, and it continued for over a month. In the 1968 election, Nixon defeats Lyndon B. Johnson and becomes the new president. And he very quickly realized that the American public is very against the Vietnam War and they want everybody to come back home. And that's exactly what Nixon did. He brought most of the US soldiers back. It's at this era that Ho Chi Minh dies at the age of 79 years old. Even though US soldiers were coming back, but the bombing had not stopped, and there was bombing every day after this. It's around this time that the Americans and the Soviets are trying to make a deal on what to do with Vietnam, this never-ending war. In the year 1973, they finally get to an agreement to take all their soldiers and weapons out of Vietnam and cut it in half just like Korea, so the war can stop. They both actually agree on this and end the war just like that, and they actually did take all the weapons and soldiers. The negotiations happened between Henry Kissinger from the American side and Le Duc Do from North Vietnam, and that is why they gave these two the Nobel Peace Prize. Henry Kissinger went out there loud and proud and took his award because he felt like he was the one that brought peace to Vietnam. But Le Duc Do declines the Nobel Peace Prize and says, not only did you guys cut our country in two, but you destroyed it completely. We get to 1974 when Nixon is supposed to resign because of the Watergate scandal, and when North Vietnam realizes that America is not in a good hand, they decide to attack South, and that was with the help of the people, because most people in South Vietnam believe that communism is better for them and it will help them in the long run, and that is why they always supported the North Vietnamese coming in. In a very short year, the North Vietnamese go all the way to Saigon and take over the entire city, the capital of South Vietnam. They surround the US embassy in Saigon, and they even had military and tanks surrounding the building. But inside there's a lot of American workers, and they're trying to escape with the helicopter on the roof. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnam completely takes over South Vietnam, and the war is now over, and the entire country turns into a socialist republic of Vietnam. They also changed the name of Saigon to Ho Chi Minh. In conclusion, communism gets to the entire country of Vietnam, and that was because the people wanted it. Many years has passed from this happening, and Vietnam is still a socialist nation, and not only did the country not succeed whatsoever, it's still very held back. This war killed more than 2.5 million people, and more than 1 million of that were civilians. It's interesting to know that the most amount of bombs dropped in one country or one war was on Vietnam. In the entire war, more than 7.5 million tons of bombs were dropped on this country. After this is the entirety of World War II in the entire world, which adds up to 2.1 million tons of bomb, a quarter of the Vietnam record. So this is when you're reminded with what Le Duc Do said, the person that debated with the Americans to end this war. He was given the Nobel Peace Prize, but he declined and told them this award means nothing.